Welcome to Fantasy Formula One Podcast, where we use fake money to buy real F1 teams to win imaginary points. I'm Paul. Ben's out today, but don't worry, he'll be back next week as we get ready to do a deep dive into this next block of 3 races, which includes 2 sprint races, by the by. Then there's going to be another 2-week break, and then we have the last 3 races of the 2024 season. For today, we're going to go down the list of drivers and kind of do an update, gauge the temperature. I don't know, like that. But we have new faces that are going to be, back around for the first time in a while, and some old faces that are out. And so there's a lot to talk about when it comes to how to set up your teams to kind of test the tide and see which way the wind's blown for some of the different drivers. But we'll go ahead and get started with the top of the Fantasy F1 driver rankings and work our way down. True to form, number 1 is Max Verstappen. However, Max Verstappen has 534 points. Number 2, Lando Norris, has 523. So yes, Max Verstappen is, is at the top of the leaderboard, but it's not like it was last year. It's not like, Max Verstappen is the clean winner and there's no right, because for anybody who didn't play last year, in 2023 you had to have Max Verstappen on your team. He was just so dominant, picking up all the points, that as soon as you didn't have him on your team, there was no other match of other drivers, no other combination of other drivers that could get you the same amount of points. So you had to have Red Bull as a constructor, you had to have Max Verstappen as your lead driver, and then however you chose to balance out Sergio Perez and Ferrari and Mercedes and your different drivers around McLaren towards the latter half of the year. That's what dictated who won. Well, this year it's not that way. This year, Lando Norris, started out not doing so hot, but McLaren's really picked it up, and now they're, just 11 points apart, fantasy-wise. So what does that mean for us as fantasy players? Well, Max Verstappen is 31.6 million. Lando Norris is 27 million. What it means is that more points are coming to Lando Norris than are going to Max Verstappen, at least recently, and Max Verstappen isn't necessarily the driver to have anymore. And I know for everybody out there who thinks I'm just a Max Verstappen hater, no, I was a fan of him before it was cool, before I even played Fantasy F1. Well, I should say the first year I played Fantasy F1, everybody, the tide was all for Lewis Hamilton, and I went with Max Verstappen, and it wasn't necessarily the smart move then, because I think that was the year, or maybe it was just when I was catching up on Drive to Survive, when both Red Bull cars crashed into each other. All right, so I'm not just riding the Max Verstappen hate train. It's right now the numbers are just not in his favor, and because he has been so dominant for so long, his price started out higher than everybody else's. So now that we're at the last 6 races, his points per million, how many points he gets every race for how much he costs every race, all the numbers are pointing towards Lewis Hamilton. Sorry, not Lewis Hamilton, pointing towards Lando Norris. That's the truth. So if you want to keep Max Verstappen on your team, go for it. But it really looks like that, barring some major mishaps or crashes, that at in the next 6 races, you will be in a better points position and have saved more money to put elsewhere on your team if you go with Lando Norris. So speaking of Lando Norris, let's go talk about him. Number 2, he has, he's again, same as last year. McLaren started out a little rough, but they kind of kicked off the dirt pretty quick, and now he's number 2. 30% of the people, 30% of Fantasy F1 has him, which is good, as opposed to 37% that has Max Verstappen. Fine. And what's interesting about this is, by and large, those numbers are mutually exclusive. So you can have 5 drivers, but you can't afford to have Max Verstappen and Lando Norris both on your team. I don't think it's mathematically possible, which means if you are one of the drivers that has Lando Norris and he does well, all the 37% of the people who get Max Verstappen on their team aren't going to be um, your competition. So so that's something to remember. Lando Norris, in my book, clear number one if you're wanting to moneyball it, if you're wanting to get the most points out of the rest of the season. Again, barring any crashes, it's Lando Norris. And that brings us to number three, Charles Leclerc. So Charles Leclerc, lead driver for Ferrari, he's the one who's staying in the seat. His teammate is going elsewhere next season. So with this whole like lead driver, second driver, sometimes it matters, sometimes it doesn't, right? Sometimes you have your lead driver and they're going to get so many more points, and the second driver, RE McLaren, will get there in a second. Sometimes the second driver is still pretty close, but you know, so with Ferrari, Carlos Sainz is 100 points behind Charles Leclerc. So Charles Leclerc is the clear number one driver to have for Ferrari. The issue is that Charles Leclerc has 447 points. Number four has 444 points, and that's Oscar Piastri. Yeah, Oscar Piastri, this is his second year, has almost as many points as Charles Leclerc, and a lot of those points have been gotten more recently. So if you have $25.3 million that you want to put into a single driver, do you put it into Charles Leclerc or do you put it into Oscar Piastri? I was burned by Ferrari in years past, so I'm very hesitant to put them on my team. However, Charles Leclerc is really strong. However, if there's a driver that's going to displace Ferrari, that's not Mercedes, it's going to be Oscar Piastri. It's going to be McLaren. So if you right now said, hey, you can put Charles Leclerc, Oscar Piastri on your team, who do you want? My heart says, believe in Ferrari. They can do it. They're Ferrari. Come on, they're doing great. But if you look at the scoreboard, Ferrari is just way too hit and miss. And Oscar Piastri and McLaren is just so strong that if you have that money to put toward a driver, unless for some reason you really want Ferrari, you have to go for Oscar Piastri. And that brings in another point that I've said in other podcasts, is that if you're looking at the rankings, McLaren is fighting Red Bull, but Red Bull, and we'll get there in a minute, is really only fighting with one driver. Mercedes and Ferrari are both fighting with two drivers. Both the drivers are doing very well, and they displace each other. So as soon as I have Ferrari and Mercedes on my team, as soon as I have Charles Leclerc and George Russell, or Charles Leclerc and Lewis Hamilton on my team, one's going to come in first, one's going to come in second, but you're not going to see them. You're not going to see Ferrari, you're not going to see Mercedes, or very rarely displace the likes of McLaren and Red Bull. I'm not saying they haven't done it. I'm saying that by and large, it's McLaren v Red Bull and it's Ferrari v Mercedes. So what does that mean for what we're talking about now? What it means is McLaren's really in their own league with Red Bull, and you shouldn't lose out on getting a McLaren asset at the cost. You shouldn't lose out on getting a McLaren asset just because you want a Mercedes or a Ferrari asset. If you can cash in a driver or a constructor in Mercedes or a driver and constructor in Ferrari for McLaren, you should really be doing that right now. Which, again, okay, I think I've beaten up the Ferrari thing enough, but Carl, I'm stammering because it's Ferrari. They're good. Charles Leclerc, he's good. He has a lot of points. He's at within 100 points of, the front. He's closing. He's not going to win, and my concern is that it's always going to be Max Verstappen and Lando Norris competing for 1 and 2, by and large, competing for 1 and 2. And then you have everybody else competing for 3, 4, and 5. And in that group of everybody you have competing for 3, 4, and 5, You definitely have Charles Leclerc, but you also definitely have Oscar Piastri. You have Lewis Hamilton. You have George Russell, and sometimes you have Sergio Perez. But Oscar Piastri has that capability to just go and do such good things that Charles Leclerc and really all of Ferrari and all of Mercedes have seen. We've seen glimmers of it, but it hasn't been pervasive. So Charles Leclerc, good, but as soon as you're going to get Charles Leclerc, do you want to get Oscar Piastri instead? I personally would go for Oscar Piastri, but I mean, again, it's up to you. If you really want to believe in Ferrari, then there you go. And that brings us to Oscar Piastri. So with Ferrari, with Red Bull, with Mercedes, with an asterisk there, with most teams, you have your lead driver and your second driver, right? You have number one and number two. You have the driver who's obviously the favorite, and you have the driver who's obviously not the favorite. With uh, with McLaren, that's not really the case, is it? With McLaren, they're not. There's not team orders that say, "Hey, Lando Norris is number one, Oscar Piastri, you're number two. Go." And you're working together to get Lando Norris the win. They're doing it where it's no, whatever's best for whatever's best for any individual drivers that's best for the team, race. And if it gets to the end that they need to throw some team orders out, they will. But what you get then is a fantasy world where you really have two lead drivers. And at any given day, unlike Red Bull of years past, you really didn't have Sergio Perez beating Max Verstappen. Sure, I get it happened a couple times, but it really wasn't the case. Well, with uh, McLaren, you can very easily have Oscar Piastri beat Lando Norris, and you can very easily have Lando Norris beat Oscar Piastri. So as soon as you can get both of those drivers on your teams, that's huge. And as soon as you can get Oscar Piastri on a team, or as soon as you can get Charles Leclerc team, you can't get Oscar Piastri on team, which you should do. So it's really interesting. The big takeaway here is if you can afford to get any elements of McLaren on your team right now, all the points, all the tides, they're all pointing towards it. That is a team to have. Those are the elements to have as you're going into this last 6 races of the season. Moving on to P5 in the championship right now. Make sure I have my thing organized right. Yeah, P5 is Lewis Hamilton. He has 375 points. Now, his teammate is P7, George Russell, who has 294. So why is Lewis Hamilton, almost 5 million, 4.5 million more expensive than George Russell? Well, because Lewis Hamilton's a seven-time world champion. So, and rightfully deserved, he's worth more money. But this year, since he is going to another team next year, it just hasn't, and he's had car problems the last several years. It's not clicking, so the value is not really there. And his teammate George Russell has been putting up just fine points as well. Sure, George Russell has 294, he's about 70 points behind, but easily 30, 40 of those points he lost in one race because of disqualifying. And I know what you're going to say. Lewis Hamilton was also disqualified at another race that cost him a podium. So I'm not trying to sit here and say that either one of the drivers is getting down and they don't have the good points. But I do think that George Russell is undervalued in the fantasy world. I don't think the points he has accurately depicts how well he can do. So, but regardless, Lewis Hamilton is more expensive and has more points. But if you have that $21 million, I say cash in Lewis Hamilton, take George Russell, and then spend some of that extra money to try and get a little bit of McLaren on your team or try and get a better constructor, things like that. Again, it's not taking anything away from Lewis Hamilton. He's definitely a very strong driver. But if you can afford him, take his teammate instead. Number 6, Carlos Sainz. He's going to another team next year. Probably some internal politics about all that. I guess now is a good time to mention with Sainz and with Leclerc. They fight each other and they fight each other dirty. They go wheel to wheel a lot, and we've seen them both wreck out, and we've seen them race each other at the cost of each one of their individual race. And I don't have all those stats right in front of me, so I'm not going to try and pretend like I do. But Carlos Sainz is 100 points to the point behind his teammate Charles Leclerc. Carlos Sainz is $23 million, and Charles Leclerc is 25.3. I think that's correct. I think Charles Leclerc is overpriced right now, simply because he's a Ferrari, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit. But he's still not putting up the points that his teammate is. He's moving to another team next year. I say stay away from Carlos Sainz right now. If you do have the $23 million to put towards Carlos Sainz, put that money into George Russell and move the value somewhere else. And sorry, Carlos, it's not anything personal. It's not anything me not liking him. Ferrari has just burned me a lot. So if you can ever divest from Ferrari, I think that's good. But also remember, the reason why I didn't win my Friends and Family League last year is because I didn't believe in Ferrari when they actually started putting everything together, and it ended up costing me. Moving on to P7, George Russell. We already talked about him. I really think he's undervalued at 21.7. That 294 points he's earned isn't 100% accurate. There should be more. It's worth being more. And yeah, so if you're trying to get another driver, I really think George Russell's a good pick to have. But as soon as you disagree with me for all the same reasons that as soon as you think I'm wrong for all the same reasons I think I'm right, I won't hold it against you. Sergio Perez, $23.1 million. All right. If you have $23 million and you need to either get Sergio Perez or you need to get Carlos Sainz, then okay, go ahead and get Carlos Sainz. Don't get Sergio Perez. And yes, he has 279 points, which is good, but he costs almost a quarter of your budget, and those points came in glimmers. Those 279 points that Sergio Perez has aren't sustained superior performance. It's not. It's a string of rough races, a couple really good ones, and a string of rough races again. And 8% have him. Yeah, those 8% probably just aren't updating their fantasy lineups much. Just stay away from Sergio Perez. I know he had a good last couple races. And this isn't anything talking about whether or not he's going to be in his seat next year. This isn't a thing about, if he's deserves to be next to Max Verstappen, or if there's anybody else who's better. No, just right now, purely from a points perspective, from a point standing, he's not the strong fantasy player to have, especially for $23 million. All right. Next is Fernando Alonso with worth $16.4 million. So Fernando Alonso and his teammate Lance Stroll. Fernando Alonso has 149 points. His teammate Lance Stroll has 94 points. Fernando Alonso is a great driver. I'm in no ways taking that from him. As far as how good of a driver he is and how good of a constructor Aston Martin is and how that translates over to the fantasy world, it really doesn't. Fernando Alonso is a gambler. He's willing to be very aggressive. He knows where his car is in the field, and he knows where he's going to finish. So he will take gambles to try and improve his race at the cost of maybe not finishing the race, which is a very dangerous thing in the fantasy world, because as soon as you don't finish the race, you get negative points, where in the real world, you don't finish a race, no one cares points-wise. So a P11 is just as good as a P20 in the point standings. I know it's not that simple, so please don't hate mail me and say, no, that's not how it all works. I get it. Lance Stroll, all right, Ben and I give him a bunch of crap. He does race. He's fine. He's a good driver. Does he deserve to be there? Yes. The only beef I have with Lance Stroll, and it does pertain to fantasy, is that the only reason he's in the seat still without any risk of losing his seat is because his dad owns the team. Now, that being said, as soon as my dad owned an F1 team, I would absolutely want and almost expect to be his driver, right? Come on. But yeah, so with Lance Stroll, don't put him on your fantasy team. He's worth $14 million. He has 94 points. Got it. As soon as you have $2 extra million lying around, I would encourage you to, as soon as you have $14 million even and you want Lance Stroll for 94 points, don't do it. Get Esteban Ocon for 12 million at 92 points. Get Nico Hulkenberg for who has 91 points at 10 million. Like, get one of those other drivers. Take lesser points, but have a driver that is going to, I don't know, be less of a risk. And that's all it is about Lance Stroll. It's not a ding against Aston Martin. If they wanted me to come out there and just sweep their floors, I would be happy to do it. That would be awesome to sweep the floors of an F1 team. But as far as having him be on your fantasy team, there's a lot better choices out there. Esteban Ocon, man, let me double check and make sure this is the right. So he's only had I think one DNF all season. He is consistently in the single digits of points. He got 10 points in Belgium. He got 16 points in Canada, 11 in I think it was in Miami, 12 in China. But everywhere else he's been, single digits. And he has got one DNF in Monaco, and I want to see maybe in Australia. Maybe just pulled a 0 in Australia. I say all that to say that it's not a lot of points for 12 million, but he's consistent and he's not getting you in the negative. So having Esteban Ocon isn't a bad person to have on your team. Holding over from the beginning of the season, though, but Alpine was so slow, they were so off the pace, they couldn't really do anything. So there's a little bit of Alpine lag in my head, but as soon as you have all your team and they're a good rock solid team and you have 13 million left, Esteban Ocon's not a bad person to have on your team. Nico Hulkenberg and Kevin Magnussen. All right. So I think it was Hulkenberg. Let me double check. Yeah. So Haas was a punchline for a long time in F1, right? And I remember back in the days of Nikita Mazepin and things like that, Haas was the gamble, Haas was the joke in fantasy. They're not that way anymore. I did take one of my teams and kind of jumped on their bandwagon back when it looked like they might start being consistently in the top 10, and they're not. But Nico Hulkenberg and Kevin Magnussen, they're good drivers to have. Their price point is just around 10, 12 million each. They're both in the, I guess Magnussen has 77 points, Hulkenberg has 91. Again, they're not going to be out that much. Let me see what's the record like, right? So they all have, so it looks like they did that big DNF in Monaco. Italy cost them some negative points for Hulkenberg. Yeah, I'm, as far as having rank and file, a good solid core drivers to put on your fantasy F1 team, I think Nico Hulkenberg and Kevin Magnussen, they're pretty good. They're not going to win you a whole lot of points, but they're probably not going to cost you any either. And that's interesting. Going into the next group of drivers are your Kick Sauber drivers. What's going to be I'm not even going to try to remember the team that bought him out for next year is Audi. But Valtteri Bottas and Zhou Yu. So Bottas is solid. He has 47 points, only cost $7 million. Zhou Yu has 43 points, only cost $7.8 million, which that's good, right? For both of them, if you're trying to spread out, like, how about this? As soon as you have a lot of money in your good drivers and you want to fill out your roster and you have 2 slots left, well, you can spend $15 million on both of these drivers for a net value of 90 points. Or you can go up to Lance Stroll, who's worth $14.4 million, roughly the same amount as both of those drivers, and he has a total value of 94 points. So you can look at both Kick Sauber drivers equal Lance Stroll. Now you're multiplying your risk by 2 if you go for both of the Kick Sauber drivers, but it does fill out your roster. And like Valtteri Bottas, he's, mullet and wacky personality included because it's awesome. I don't think he's DNF'd since China. I'm looking back here at the numbers. He's been at least in the positive since Italy, got -2, got -14 in China. The dude's a solid driver. The issue with Kick Sauber, with Valtteri Bottas, and really Zhou Yu, is not the drivers, it's the constructor. It's that when they do DNF, it's because just weird stuff happens, and it's not because they were pushing the envelope too hard and missed. It's because they were driving solid and suddenly their car pooed out on them. So that's the danger with Kick Sauber. I would go with Valtteri Bottas over Zhou Guanyu just because their DNF record. Again, I don't have it in front of me, but I know Zhou Guanyu is more prone to DNFs than Valtteri Bottas is. On to Yuki Tsunoda for Team VCARB. So anybody who's unindoctrinated, VCARB stands for Visa Cash App Red Bull. I lovingly or not so lovingly call them Baby RB for the longest time. But Yuki Tsunoda for VCARB, he's worth $10 million. He has 43 points. He hasn't gotten into too much DNF trouble. Oh, wait, I'm wrong. He DNF'd in Azerbaijan. He DNF'd in Italy, and he got negative points in the Netherlands. He got 4 points in Singapore. So in the last 4 races, he has cost you over 25 points. And that's just too much of a liability to have on a fantasy F1 team. So he's worth $10 million. You would have spent $30 million spent almost $50 million over the last 4 races to get negative 25 points. I divested Yuki a while back. He's just too big of a liability to have on your fantasy F1 team. Pierre Gasly, moving on. Pierre Gasly, the other Alpine driver, same issue I have with Pierre Gasly is the same issue I have with Esteban Ocon. It's just Alpine. They started out the year really poor. Pierre Gasly had some negative points in Azerbaijan. Looks like he did back-to-back DNFs in UK and in Hungary. And maybe I'm just misremembering, and his teammate also did, but just got more points otherwise. I really doubt it. Alpine altogether is not as bad. Is not as big a liability as Kick Sauber, I don't feel, but still, really taking your life into your own hands to have him there. So, and this part's really cool. Here we go. Ready? Next on the list of, now I'm going through this list based on their number of fantasy points they've scored all year. All right. Next is Franco Colapinto. All right. Brand new driver at 26 points. Immediately followed by Alex Albon with 13 points. You heard it right, folks. Franco Colapinto. And I apologize if Colapinto, sorry if I'm butchering his name, has more points than Alex Albon. And if you remember, Alex Albon was the standard that my countryman was always being measured to, right? Alex Albon was this lead wonderful driver for Team Williams. And then here's my countryman Logan Sargent, who was always, oh, you're not quite like Alex Albon. You know, Alex crashed his car, so you're going to give Alex Albon your car and let him race it, sort of thing. Then in comes this rookie who they put him in after, 1 or 2 races. Let me check. How long has he been in the seat? Okay, so he has 3 races under his belt, and he's already doing better than the lead driver from 4 races ago. So I think you should absolutely get Franco Colapinto on your fantasy team. You absolutely should. And there's a couple reasons. One is look at the scoreboard. He costs, 3/4 what Alex Albon did, and he's got exactly double the points. But the second reason is his value's going up by about $500,000 a race. So if you get him now, safe to say that in 4 races or after this next three race stick, he's going to be worth $1.5 million at least more than he is now. So then you can sell him and use that extra money to get somebody else. But also, as soon as this guy is consistently putting up about 9 points a race for $6 million, that's a great buy-in for a solid little bit trickle charge of points, and he's not costing you any points, and he's filling out a spot on your roster. So I 100% think you should get Franco Colapinto on your team. It's kind of surprising to me that only 15% have him, while 51% have Alex Albon. And moving on to Alex Albon, again, nothing negative about him, but he DNF'd in Singapore. I think he DNF'd in the Netherlands too. Canada, Italy, and Japan were all negative numbers for him. So as soon as you have, $10 million to spend or $8.8 million to spend, are you going to put it into Alex Albin, or are you going to get Franco Colapinto that'll give you more points and take that extra, call it $2 million, and put it somewhere else? Go ahead, go with Franco, divest Alex Albin. Do I think it's bad if you put both of them in your lineup? No, they would cost they cost roughly the same amount as both Valtteri Bottas and Zhou Guanyu. So should you have both Kick Sauber or both Williams? Honestly, I'd probably go Franco, Colapinto, and Valtteri, just because Alex Albin has had consistent DNF trouble recently up to Singapore. So I wouldn't have Alex Albin. I'd go with Franco and then try and get Valtteri if you're looking at that. And this brings me to the last driver in our lineup. And keep in mind, these are just active drivers, all right? The last driver in the lineup for right now is Liam Lawson. So good on him for getting a seat. Good on him for getting back in. For anybody who's uninitiated about all the drama that went on with him and V Carb and Daniel Ricciardo. So Daniel Ricciardo was in a mishap last year. Daniel Ricciardo, so Nick DeVries was driving for V Carb. I guess he wasn't for not V Carb, for whatever that team was at that time. What is now V Carb. But Daniel Ricciardo was driving. Nick DeVries was driving for this team. Wasn't performing. They ousted him. Brought in Daniel Ricciardo. Crashed during practice. Broke his hand. And like overnight, they needed somebody who could fill in. They didn't go for the Red Bull or the Ferrari or one of the other teams that work out a deal to get any of the reserve drivers. They didn't even call up their reserve driver. They instead basically overnight delivered Liam Lawson from Japan or from Europe because he was racing in the league over there. They brought him over, strapped him in, and he did well. And there was some talk if he would just stay in his seat. But he didn't. He got signed up as a reserve driver for Red Bull. And so Liam Lawson has been sitting in the wings waiting for stuff to happen while Daniel Ricciardo, got the chance to prove himself this season. And it just hasn't panned out for him. There's a lot that goes into it. I'm not going to sit here and say whether he should or shouldn't be there, but that's the way the cookie crumbled. And you could tell if you watched the last race, Daniel Ricciardo knew it was his last race because he just stayed in the cockpit a little bit longer and just kind of enjoyed being there. And I can definitely identify with those thoughts and those feelings. So Liam Lawson's in. He has 0.0 everything, but he costs $10 million, all right? Because you can't put him... He has a good enough record that as soon as he costs anything less, everybody would get him. And so he costs $10 million. All right. He costs actually 10.2. He costs the exact same as Yuki Tsunoda, his teammate. So if you have $10.2 million, should you put in Yuki Tsunoda or should you put in Liam Lawson? And this might be an unpopular opinion. Fire Yuki Tsunoda, put in Liam Lawson. And I didn't get in this with Franco, but the reason why you want Liam Lawson and the reason why you want Franco Colapinto on your team is that they are not going to goof it up. The die is cast for where the teams are going to be. The teams aren't trying to be ultra aggressive, at least like V Carb and Williams. They're not trying to be ultra aggressive. They're not trying to sit here and dethrone P1 and make a huge name for themselves in the last 6 races. They're wanting to, if they have the lead, they want to keep the lead. If they're close to the lead, they want to apply pressure on whoever the team is ahead of them. But they're not going to trash their car this close to the end of the season. That is not what these new drivers want. With Liam Lawson coming in and with Franco Colapinto, again, if somebody here knows more about F1 than I do, which there are plenty of you out there who do, they're not, correct me, but Liam Lawson, your Franco Colapinto, they're not coming in here to try and make waves. They're here to do good things for the team, help car evolution, support the other drivers, put on a good show, but also get ready for next season. And I really think these new drivers coming in for the last 6 races are a good bet to have. You can fill up 2 slots in your lineup, but also it's your 16.5 million for both of them, and they're not going to do any worse than Yuki Tsunoda. They're not going to do any worse than Alex Albon. They're not going to do any worse than Zhou Yu. You know, all the points that those drivers have already earned, they're earned. They're not going to, that doesn't matter. Everybody's basically, you can look at it. Now, maybe this isn't accurate. You can look at how the points they scored all season long as a metric for how well we expect them to do in the future. But the 40, was it 43 points that Yuki Tsunoda had do not impact his points going forward. And Yuki Tsunoda has 43 points. It doesn't matter. He might not score another point the rest of the season. So you have to look at value. You have to look risk versus reward, but you also have to look at track record. And Liam Lawson had a very strong track record last year. And Yuki Tsunoda this year is costing $10 million a race. And I don't know if you take 43 divided by, 18, how many points that is. But it's what, less than 2.5. Again, that's public math off the top of my head, so go easy. But will Liam Lawson earn more than 3 fantasy points a race? If so, then he's somebody you should definitely consider. So that is the rundown of the drivers. We're going to talk about constructors real quick, even though I really kind of touched on them. The big thing is, for constructors, you have to have McLaren as your constructor. You have to. They have 196 fantasy points. Red Bull has, McLaren has 1,096 fantasy points. Red Bull has 1,098 fantasy points. And that is a majority of Red Bull's fantasy points occurred early on in the season. So let's go and take a look at all the races real quick. The first 3 races of the season: Bahrain, Red Bull got 89, Saudi, Red Bull got 90, and then Australia, Red Bull got 32, then 4. Japan, they got 108. The last 4 races have been 52, 40, 26, 47. So for the last 4 races, Red Bull has pretty consistently been getting half the points they got every race at the beginning. Does that make sense? I hope so. Their cars just aren't as fast relative to the rest of the cars in the field. And if you listen to and if you read, I should say, some of the comments that we get on our social medias, there's some other issues going on with the cars too. But if you look at McLaren, so if you look at McLaren, their first 4 races were 36, 41, 54, 39. Okay, so easily below around half of what Red Bull was getting. But the last 4 races have been 81, 83, 85, 81. McLaren is consistently getting in the 80s. McLaren is consistently getting twice the points that Red Bull is getting. And the reason why is Red Bull is really racing with one driver. Sergio Perez, if he finishes in the top 10, that's good. If he finishes over 5, that's really good. If he finishes P8, we're like, okay, that kind of checks. But McLaren has 2 drivers that regularly fight with each other for the podium, and then the other one will finish in the top 3. So McLaren is the constructor to have. If you have the $29.3 million to spend on Red Bull as a constructor, get rid of them. Put McLaren as a constructor for $26.5, and then put the rest of the money towards where the big question is: do you get Ferrari or do you get Mercedes as your constructor? Mercedes is $24 million. Ferrari is $24.7. Ferrari has 987 points. Mercedes has 830. So if you look at the scoreboard, Ferrari is doing better. However, we can go ahead and take a look. Actually, I'm not going to worry about that. Ferrari is doing better points-wise, but Mercedes and Ferrari displace each other. So if one has a good race, the other will have a not-so-good race and vice versa. But really neither one of them have that capability to, over the next 6 races, have both drivers continually in the top 3, which is why, since that's what McLaren has that capability for, you go with McLaren. And then it's just really, who do you want to gamble with, Ferrari or Mercedes? I personally tend to go with Mercedes over Ferrari. Ben disagrees. He goes with Ferrari over Mercedes. And we'll see how it all breaks out. I did try to go with Haas for a little bit for a constructor. That's not a good idea. That was a glimmer that really didn't pay out. But just in case anybody out there is new listening to this and you're like, man, how come it's only those constructors? Any given car in any given race can win. By definition, you're not wrong, but that's also not true. Not every car can win without there being a huge mishap or a huge accident. All right. And just to drive that home, Red Bull has 1,098 fantasy points. McLaren has 1,096. Ferrari has 987. All pretty close. Mercedes has 830. Okay, about 150 points behind Ferrari. A lot of that delta is from earlier in the year where Mercedes couldn't get their tires to roll, let alone do well, and Ferrari was doing well. Then there's a massive, almost 500-point drop-off down to Aston Martin that has 358. Yes, almost 500 points between P4 and P5 in the fantasy constructor standings. Then Haas at 255, then V-Carb at 204, Alpine at 186, Kick Sauber at 105. Kick Sauber has 105. Kick Sauber has 1/10 of the points that McLaren and that Red Bull do. So when I harp so much, and we here on this podcast, bang the foot on the wall so much, we floor stomp so much to say, hey, you have to have McLaren, and then you pick Ferrari or Mercedes and gamble because there's no one else. As soon as you get Red Bull, fine, but they're slipping. McLaren is going to overtake them. I think they already did in the real life constructor standings. They're going to do it in the fantasy standings after this next race, and then it just comes down to who you want to put your money with, Mercedes or Ferrari. And I believe in George Russell. I like Lewis Hamilton. I believe in the team of Mercedes more than the team of Ferrari, but I know Ben disagrees with me and anybody else out there. I'm not saying you're wrong. You just got to kind of, pick which camp you want to stay in and say good luck. But that is the quick rundown maybe not so quick, but the rundown of your fantasy drivers and your fantasy constructors and where we're standing right now, gearing up for the last 6 races of the season. Next week, Ben will be back, and we're going to do a dive into what to expect with these sprint races. We're going to talk about everything else you need to make sure your teams are as ready as they can be. I would strongly encourage you to do not lock in your fantasy teams until after the free practices this coming weekend. And the reason is because I know I said go ahead and get both of the drivers, for sure, both of the new drivers on your team, absolutely. Go ahead and set them on up and take a screenshot of it so you know who you want. But so much can happen in free practice, and all it takes is for one car to start, having issues. It takes one of these drivers to crash. And then because of the new rules that come up, maybe I should do scene break, here's this new thing. So the rules now state that if you have an inactive driver on your roster, you will take that negative 20-point hit just as like they didn't finish. It used to be if you had an inactive driver on your roster, it was no harm, no foul. You just only had 4 drivers racing. But there's so many drivers going in and out now that they changed the rules, and you can now get penalized. You get negative 5 points for not classifying in a qualifying, and you'll get negative 20 points for not classifying in the race. And if coming up this weekend at the at Austin, Texas, I think is where it's at, there's a sprint race, which means if you have a driver not classified, if you have a driver that's inactive on your roster going into this weekend, you will get negative 50 points for that driver. Negative 5 points for each of the sprint race, for each of the qualifiers, and negative 20 points for each of the race. So you must. If you have Daniel Ricciardo, you must switch him out. But be careful to not do it too early, because as soon as you do switch him out and you use up all of your exchanges, and then somebody crashes out and they put the reserve driver in, and you still have that driver that's no longer going to be there, you'll take that negative 20. So there's that. Take it for what it's worth. But I hope you enjoyed this. I hope this was helpful. And I hope you have a great last week running up to the last 6 races of the season. Cheers.